So one of my first CV reviewers was a friend who is not from a life science background, but he was working in one of the bigger consulting firms. And the first thing he said was, I do not understand a word of this, and I doubt anyone would. In academia, as I often say, you don't have a client, you don't have a deliverable, and you don't have a product. Anyone who has done a life science PhD and is kind of afraid that, if I go into the commercial world, things might get diluted and I wouldn't have my scientific rigor, I would say do rethink that position. If you're doing a very science-driven PhD, even if you're involved with the drug discovery aspect of things, you would have perhaps a good understanding about preclinical data, in vitro data, animal models, etc. But that doesn't necessarily translate to the skill of interpreting clinical data.
Welcome. If you're watching this, there's a good chance you've spent years, possibly better part of a decade, in a laboratory, a library, or both. You've pipetted thousands of samples, read hundreds of papers, and defended ideas in front of a room full of experts. And now you're standing at a doorway wondering what comes next. Whether you're finishing your PhD, whether you recently graduated, or a few years into your career and wondering if you're on the right path, this conversation is for you. Today, I'm joined by a good friend and someone who has navigated exactly those crossroads. Souro holds a PhD in chemical biology from Imperial College London, and which is one of the world's leading research institutes, and has been working in a boutique life science consulting firm for over 3 years now. We're going to talk about his journey, the highs, the hard moments, the decisions that shaped his career, and the lessons he wishes someone had shared with him earlier. I hope this conversation gives you something useful, whether that's a new perspective, a framework, or simply the reassurance that you're not alone in figuring this out. So let's get into it. So, Souro, for anyone watching who doesn't know you, give us a brief summary of who you are and what you do.
Sure. Thanks, Vin, for having me over. So just for a bit of context, as Vin mentioned, I did a PhD in chemical biology, most recently from Imperial College London, and since then I've been working in the life sciences consulting sector for about 3 years now. It's a bit about my background and journey. I started off as a chemist, and I worked as a scientist for around a year at a pharmaceutical company. And what really originally motivated me was to be involved in particular with the discovery of drugs and medicines, be involved with the cutting edge and hardcore, making the very first molecules that can one day hopefully impact millions, if not billions of patients. That was the real driving force for studying chemistry. But over the years, obviously, I learned that drug discovery is a much more complex process than any individual scientist's kind of contribution. And in that journey, I've sort of switched eventually from chemistry towards chemical biology, and towards the very end of my PhD, I was basically operating as a biologist. And then we'll get into how I eventually ended up in consulting.
Amazing. Let's get a little bit more into that. So you mentioned that you transitioned from biology to chemical biology and finally into the pharmaceutical field. So can you take us back to the beginning? What made you pursue a PhD rather than going straight into industry, and why chemical biology? Why biology was your field of choice?
Sure. So this came out more from a sense of, a realization that most sort of scientists working in the drug discovery sector, so whether that is in academia or non-profits or for-profit pharmaceutical companies, they tend to have a background at the intersection of chemistry, biology, and very often statistics as well. These are the three key ingredients, I would say, to be a good drug hunter. So along the way, I met many people working in R&D divisions at some of the biggest pharmaceutical companies, and I sought advice throughout my career since my days as an undergraduate and a master's student. And the main suggestion I received at that time was the basic requirement of pretty much leading a research program in the future in the pharmaceutical sector would have been either a PhD or a medical background. So that was the main sort of thinking at that time.
Great. And was there a moment, a particular person, a mentor, or conversation or discovery that made you think, yes, this is what I want to do?
That's a very good question. I would say nothing of a singular moment. I grew up in a family where I saw a lot of medics around me, and I've just always had the curiosity since childhood, like who makes the discoveries behind all these prescriptions. So I saw doctors obviously write prescriptions and hundreds of those. That's one impact, but I was always fascinated by all the steps that come before it. So before the doctor is able to write that prescription, who establishes that this actually works? What is the evidence? What is the safety, dosage? And I never got a clear answer, I have to say. Nobody can really tell you who discovered paracetamol, for example, because ultimately the process is complex and it's highly interdisciplinary, and it's a lot of people coming together towards that pursuit.
Amazing. And when you decided to do a PhD, I'm guessing you had a sense of what it would be like.
Yes.
How did that compare to reality?
Fairly close. I would say I have been relatively lucky in terms of my PhD experience. So let's take a little bit of a step back. I would like to say that my PhD was an overwhelmingly positive experience. I enjoyed it a lot, and if I could live those years again or live a life again, I would do exactly that PhD. So there was no negativity whatsoever, which is something we often hear, horror stories, etc., which does happen. But I would like to put it out that there's also very positive experiences that can come out of it.
Right, very well said. So let's talk in a little bit more detail about your PhD experience, like the whole journey. But specifically, if you wanted to tell us about what your typical week looked like, or was the day-to-day like you're doing your PhD, what was the rhythm of work? How would you describe that?
Yeah, looking back, I would say it was quite slow-paced, very, very academic, if there is a word for it. I worked hours in which I was most efficient. So that would, for me, typically be starting a day in the lab from sort of around 9:30, quarter to 10. I would start off, meeting with my other research group people, a bit of socializing to begin with, and then kind of following up on any experimental results. Sometimes there would be experiments running overnight, so I would be very excited to see whether they worked or didn't work, or did the cells grow, or did they give the right signals, etc. And then kind of like on the basis of those results, take a bit of a step back, plan out the next steps, and initiate the next round of experiments, because these would often run overnight. At least that's how my PhD topic just happened to be, that there would be these long 8-hour experiments that would pretty much run overnight. And then I would set those up by maybe 3:30, 4, it would be all set up, and around that time I would try and essentially put together all the data in a bit more details, and analyze those, document everything, journal them, and sort of make sure files and directories are organized. I was always obsessed with organization, which is a good skill to have, I learned eventually. But that would be a broad day, and typically sometimes I would initially finish at 6 p.m., sometimes 5, sometimes 7, it varies a little bit. I would take a break, have dinner, and oftentimes I would go back into the labs again around 10 or 11 p.m. just to check in if the experiment started off properly or not, because otherwise it's an entire day wasted if I go back the next day and it didn't start.
Right. And on the topic of mundane problems and challenges, what was it working with supervisors, peers, ensuring funding, all those things that you encounter on the daily basis? How was that in your PhD?
Yeah, I would say it was very enjoyable overall. So I was quite lucky in that my funding was not linked to my supervisor. So I had Imperial gave me a scholarship that's fully funded through alumni donations. So it's true freedom to pursue any topic you want with the financial security for both the research grant and your own stipend. So that was very lucky to do this sort of a scholarship in a city like London. But of course there were many challenges along the way. Certainly COVID was a big theme during my PhD. I remember about a year in, 17th of March, I still remember the date, we got an email from the provost asking us to switch off all experiments overnight in a safe fashion so that buildings could close down. And after that, it was quite challenging for the next months, if not up to a year, to do an experimental PhD, because there were all sorts of compliance and regulatory requirements around, not having as many people in a laboratory or social distancing and all of that. So I think Imperial went through its own experimentations of the models. We had a situation where we decided initially each researcher would go in 5 days straight and then self-isolate for 9 days to kind of match the peaks and troughs of the virus incubation period, etc. That was quite intense because you're still limited by your 3.5-4 year funding, and you want to fit all experiments in those 4 years. So what that meant was a lot of us were compressing 14 days worth of work in 5 days, front-loading it, and then spending 9 days analyzing the data. So that was kind of like going from highs to lows. It was interesting times, but again, very unique, and if I were to do it again, I would.
Right. What skills did you develop during your PhD that you didn't expect to need, but eventually found them quite useful?
I would say critiquing data and being a exceptionally strong self-critique, being truly objective. I think these are things that you kind of expect a science or a STEM PhD to have, but the extent of it that you really develop when you're doing any biological or life sciences PhD, you're constantly thinking about positive control, negative control, what's the counterfactual, and you're in this environment in a almost day-to-day basis, and that truly turns you into a very objective person. And I did not expect for the transition to be so transformative. Like, I knew it would happen because hey, PhDs go through a rigorous training, but the extent of it was a bit of a surprise once I graduated and looked back.
Right. And as you just were trying to tell me, it's a quite mentally taxing period of someone's life to go through postgraduate research.
Yeah.
How did you kind of manage it? How did you cope with it?
That's a very good question and an important one. I would say this is something one of my friends told me, and I love that perspective, which is that when a PhD candidate is hired, it's not the candidate that is hired, it's their entire support system that is hired into the program. So having that support system, group of family, friends around you to lean on, even if they're non-scientific audience, they might have no training, but you can still always reach out to them, talk to them, and kind of it teaches you to not just share your journey and your ups and downs, but it also teaches you how to communicate science to someone who might not necessarily be from a scientific background. So if you have a friend or family who is not even remotely related to science, do not think that they will not be able to help you. Actually, they might come up with ideas that are entirely out of the box and can help you run your experiments.
Okay, so when did you first start thinking seriously about what comes after PhD?
That's interesting because I actually always wanted to become an academic. Like I'm sure many of your audience may be thinking or may have been thinking. And until kind of like the very end of my PhD, I was still keen to follow an academic trajectory, because I truly thought that, being at that intersection of chemistry and biology, but also pursuing the scientific questions of drug discovery at a very fundamental level, that was best served by academia. In some ways, I still believe in that. The challenge, of course, was in terms of pursuing an academic career. There's the question of getting grants and fellowships in the future. And to me, this sounded like a little bit linking my pursuit for innovation to my existential self, and I didn't think that was a right trade-off. So it was a difficult decision to come to. Eventually, towards when I was about 6 months away from submitting my thesis, I made the following decision that, okay, let me look into career options outside of academia. So how to sort of still live the same dream of contributing to medicine's discovery, etc. But at the same time, I wrote a grant application for a postdoctoral fellowship with my dream team, which was at University College London. And so I essentially threw both in there and kind of a spray and pray approach. Luckily enough, both worked out. I got an offer to join the consulting firm that I currently work at, and a couple of weeks after accepting the offer, I heard that I won the postdoc grant as well, which was a really good 3 years grant with the dream team. So that was kind of a challenging moment. So I'm writing up my thesis. I have these two options, one of which I've already sort of accepted in principle, and then this grant comes in. So it was a tough moment, I would say one of the toughest decisions of my life. But again, what really played in was sort of trying to separate my existential self from my innovative self, and I thought that an industrial career is the only right way to do that.
That's a great way of putting it. I can only imagine the fight that was happening in your mind at that time with two kind of very different but equally substantial paths in front of you and having to choose between the two. If we focus on your industry search or that path, like how did you figure out which roles or sectors were relevant to someone with your background, and what was that process like? How did you go about doing that?
Yeah, so it did need a bit of how I would describe it now as qualitative market research. So essentially talking to a lot of people, as many people as possible, and understanding what is it that they do. Trying to scout through Google, LinkedIn, social media, tapping into friends and family networks to figure out anyone with a life science background, what are they doing now, 5-6 years out of their education. So interacting with people gives you these ideas, and some of the kind of common themes I picked up, at least in the London market, which was my main focus. I love living in London. I enjoyed doing my PhD, so I wanted to stay in London. And the key themes I picked up were a lot of people were in venture capital. Again, a very scientific pursuit, but intersects with a bit of commerce and finance as well. some were in investment banking and some in consulting. These were the three main, I would say, services-oriented fields. And then there was a fourth bucket of people who were either sort of working in a big pharmaceutical company in a purely laboratory-based role, or there were also people contributing to biotechs and startups, both around the Imperial Innovation Cluster or greater London area, Cambridge, Oxford, etc. as well. So those were all options, and it was an interesting process to sieve through all of these potential avenues and find out which one resonated the most with me.
Right. And it seems like you did quite a lot of networking, and maybe you are a natural networker, but for a lot of people who are not that, they are a bit maybe shy or apprehensive of talking to other people for such kind of things or building networks. What would you suggest? Like how would someone in that position, where should they start? How should they try and break out of that bubble and build their network?
That's definitely something that I wish someone also told me when I was doing these searches. So firstly, I'm personally not extroverted at all, so it didn't come naturally to me, and it is okay for it to not come naturally. But what I think we all need to remember when it comes to networking, especially networking out of an academic bubble, is that you don't lose anything if you cold reach out to someone you don't know, but you're curious about their career or their work. I would say try and contact as many people as you can. Ask them if they have 5 minutes, 10 minutes in the next 2 months to help you out, give you their perspectives, and you will find that, surprisingly, at least what I found, that more than half of the people were happy to share their journey and advice with me, even if they had no apparent connection. So networking doesn't necessarily have to be that you sort of inherit a huge network of people in a certain sector. No, it can be completely out of your own construction as well.
You talk us through the practical side, preparing a CV, writing application, interviews, and what surprised you about this process the most?
Yeah, so I would say my first advice, first of all, I got my CV reviewed by a number of people. Some of them I knew from before, but some of them I didn't even know, and they offered to help, look at my CV and give feedback. And any feedback was valuable. So one of my first CV reviewers was a friend who is not from a life science background, but he was working in one of the bigger consulting firms. And the first thing he said was, "I do not understand a word of this, and I doubt anyone would." So that was surprising, little bit shocking, but also an important piece of feedback. And I'm glad it came without any sugarcoating or anything of that sort. So what is important for people with an academic background trying to do this transition is to realize, how can you express your CV, your achievements, your whatever you've done in the past 3-6 years in a way that is commercially relatable. And that is a communication style that comes over time. And I would say that in itself is a journey. Simply rewriting the CV to the best possible format, in my mind, that should take at least time in the order of months, sometimes even years, because you do need to go through that transition yourself, and someone else cannot write down your achievements on your behalf in a more commercial language.
Right. And so how did you approach that? And when you were writing your CVs, how did you translate your scientific experience into a language that HR team members and business leaders can understand?
Yeah. I think that's a absolutely important problem that a lot of people will face. So certainly using feedback, it's an iterative process. It cannot happen in one go. It's not something that you sit down on a Sunday afternoon and redo your CV. you have to iterate several times. So after getting the initial feedback, I changed and I asked the people like, okay, what do you take away from this, to try and understand how much are they understanding of what I'm trying to explain, and also getting to know their perspectives on what is commercial, what is impact, what is it that they're looking for. And one of my personal key takeaways from several of those conversations was to make things generally more numerical and impact driven. So rather than saying something like, I worked to discover X and Y scientific truth, what was the impact of it? So it could be that your discovery led to a potential new R&D program, or uncovered a new pathway which could target cancer or a certain disease. That is something of greater commercial relevance. So trying to think through your achievement, your journey during PhD, and kind of figuring out what those points were that are potentially translatable commercially, that is very important. And then just iterate hundreds of times. I think the version of CVs that eventually went out for my job interviews, that was possibly the 200th iteration.
What does a life science employer actually care about when they're looking at a PhD graduate? What's the signal that they're trying to find?
I would say it varies from a little bit from employer to employer, but overall,
in your current, where you are, consulting,
in a consulting environment, I would say the main signals are whether they're good at communications. So that will again come out in terms of how they have written their CV. That's one aspect. And also critical thinking. I think perseverance is something that is very important in a lot of these roles. And if you can provide any signals of perseverance in the face of failures and how you turn that into success, that is again a good signal to give out. Also collaborations. A lot of PhDs, particularly in the UK, are very collaborative. So you might be working in a biology lab but collaborating with physicists or chemists elsewhere. That teaches you a lot about communication, translation from one field of work to another, teamwork. These are all things to talk about in your CV and in your job interviews. And I would say those are the main ones that would differentiate someone who might be a good fit in consulting or not. And then of course an important element of this transition is to show a clear signal that you can operate in a commercial environment. So if you've done any internships, etc., during your PhD or perhaps before your PhD, do mention that and talk about it.
Can you describe briefly the nature of your current job and how it has evolved since you first started working in the industry?
Yes, of course. So I work at a life science consulting firm, just for your viewers' knowledge. And what this means is that this is a services company that provides, mainly caters to the pharmaceutical companies. So most of the big brand names for medicines that you would have heard, we cater to those types of companies, and also mid-sized biotech. So these are the main clientele. And at a high level, what we do is help with the whole process of both research, so R&D, as well as the commercialization, but from a very different perspective, which I will get to in just a moment. So essentially, as some of you may be aware, some of you watching this may be aware, drug discovery is a risky process that costs a lot of money and takes a long time, right? So these bigger pharmaceutical companies, they would have at any given point many parallel pursuits of innovation together. So some companies might have even hundreds of drugs that they're investigating in various diseases, from oncology to nephrology to hematology, so many things. And really the question becomes, how do you minimize your risk ultimately on your investments? How do you prioritize a given budget between two research programs. So it's ultimately about helping shape the choices of R&D managers. So that is one aspect to it, and to that end we use various methods. At my current employer we have 4 what we call practice areas, but you can think of it as methods to answer those questions or reduce those risks. So we do market research, which for instance involves talking to payers, patients, doctors, etc., to understand some of the unmet needs in the diseases better. And the second method we use is known as competitive intelligence, which involves finding out what's out there, essentially being the eyes of the organization, so that if you see any signals externally that might increase or decrease your own risk, you can respond to it appropriately. And the third area or method we look into is called market access, and this involves, in countries like UK or in much of Europe, ultimately medicines are overwhelmingly taxpayer funded. So essentially making the case whether a certain drug for a certain disease is cost effective for the taxpayer or not. So doing the modeling, understanding the regulators' appetite to pay and to what degree, all those sorts of things. So the very wide range of services, but all towards the same ambition of discovering a molecule, prioritizing its at-risk clinical development, and then if it's successful, helping it become a commercial success as well, not just a regulatory success.
Right. So the culture in the industry is known to be very different from that in academia. What caught you off guard in your first few months that you started working?
Absolutely, very different from academia. I wouldn't disagree at all with that. I would say what was surprising was the pace of work and the pace of learning as well. I think in academia, particularly when you're doing a PhD, you're very used to kind of going in deep, really deep, and chasing sort of one idea or question in a lot of depth. Whereas what matters in industry is not necessarily the breadth, but the ability to zoom in and out as required. And that is a different kind of cognitive skill. And this is something that I think, the PhD didn't prepare me well enough. And it was a bit of a learning experience over the last few years.
And is there also an element of adapting to the more, I guess, collaborative, communicative nature of industry? Because I'm imagining that when you're doing your PhD, a lot of it was your individual work, individual expertise, working with those experiments, and less of working in a big team, let alone multiple teams. So how was that transition for you?
100%. I think in academia, as I often say, you don't have a client, you don't have a deliverable, and you don't have a product. It's just open-ended and pure pursuit of human curiosity in many ways. Whereas once you turn into the more commercial world, you would have either a product that you're working towards, a customer, a client, something of that sort. So there are expectations and constraints within which you must operate and function. And you're also working, as we discussed, on sometimes much shorter time scales, because industry can be a little bit impatient in terms of achieving its impact. And it's a competitive environment as well, because if you're slow in your pursuit, your competitor can obviously go in and capitalize on that. So all of these external factors ultimately means that when you're working in industry, you're working as a team. Your effort alone is not enough. You have to amplify human effort, and the only way to do that is to all work together in a cooperative and collaborative way. So I think communication is very different. From an academic perspective, I felt that in the first few months or weeks, industry was almost over communicative. But I do see the importance of it now, especially kind of having done this for 3 years. Certainly, over-communicative in a team environment is often better than lack of communication at all.
How do you maintain scientific rigor and intellectual curiosity when you're working in a commercial environment?
It's a very good question. I mean, for people who are specifically working within the life sciences sector, I think this is sometimes easier to do than if you're working in, let's say, TMT or entertainment or something of that sort. Because ultimately, even if you're involved in a very commercial project, let's say about maximizing the revenues of a drug, it's not like selling a television, right? If you want to differentiate between drug X and drug Y, you have to understand all the properties of the two drugs, the different patients and demographics they might be more suited to, the efficacy, the data, the trial design, and all of that. So it's inherently a scientific pursuit in that regard. So anyone who has done a life science PhD and is kind of afraid that, oh, if I go into the commercial world, things might get diluted and I wouldn't have my scientific rigor, I would say do rethink that position, because it's in many ways even more demanding in terms of scientific integrity and rigor, because ultimately your paper, if you're publishing a paper, gets reviewed by 3 or 4 peer reviewers. But if you're bringing a drug to a market that is impacting millions of lives, that data gets scrutinized by not just the regulators and the doctors, but the market itself.
If you had to identify 3 skills that have made the biggest difference to your career, what would they be, and which one surprises you?
I would say number 1, perseverance, number 2, communications, and number 3, writing. So number 2 would have been verbal communications, and number 3, writing. And what surprised me the most was number 3, which is writing. I mean, nowadays you have large language models, etc., to assist with that, which I think is great. It amplifies human ability. But in my initial days, or when I was even applying for jobs, etc., large language models were not sufficiently sophisticated to help write a cover letter, for example. But as you progress in your career in an industrial setting, you would more often than not, your first medium of communication with someone, whether that is a potential customer, potential client, or a regulator, is your written word. And it does have a big impact on the chances that someone will get back to you, chances that they will get back to you positively or negatively. And I always thought of writing as a more creative pursuit. That's how I picked up that skill. But it turns out it's very commercially utilizable as well.
Is there a technical skill you wish you had developed during your PhD that would have served you better in industry?
I would say so. I would say 2 areas that I perhaps, I wouldn't say neglected to develop, but didn't necessarily have the obvious avenues or opportunities to develop. One was really around assessing clinical data. So if you're doing a very science-driven PhD, even if you're involved with the drug discovery aspect of things, you would have perhaps a good understanding about preclinical data, in vitro data, animal models, etc. But that doesn't necessarily translate to the skill of interpreting clinical data, which tends to be more messy, and it's a different signal to noise calibration. So that was a skill I could have easily developed in principle, because all of the clinical data is publicly available. So you can look into drugs that get approved versus don't get approved, and try and understand what are the considerations of risk benefit and things like that. So that's one aspect. The other thing I would say is having a greater understanding of artificial intelligence and coding in general is something I wish I developed a little bit more, and this is something I would say I did neglect because there were certain opportunities to do so. I didn't necessarily take up on those opportunities, but now we're working with humans and AI day in, day out, so it really helps have that grounding and understanding of what AI can and cannot do.
That's an interesting point to bring up, and obviously when you were doing your PhD, LLMs were not a thing, at least not commercially available and widely used. Now that they are, and a lot of people are undergoing or pursuing their PhD while they have access to all of these tools, a lot of them probably using them to help write their thesis, etc. What would you say are the things that they should be aware of in terms of advantages and potential pitfalls of using AI, developing the right skills with it, and then translating those into something that they can use successfully in their industry career?
That's a very thought-provoking question. I mean, we don't want to necessarily be future predictors here, which is the pace of the AI innovation is so fast right now that it's very hard to give an advice, because for instance we are recording this today in the year 2026. Perhaps next year AI will again surprise us with even more tricks. But that said, I would say general advice would be do not become reliant on AI to the extent that if AI were to break or you were to lose your internet connection, you will not be able to do the job to the extent that AI would help you do it. So retain your human capabilities and independence. That would be one aspect. So things like writing, etc., and really having a thought around what is it that I'm trying to communicate, what are the broad themes, and organizing your written word in that fashion. That is a skill that's very easy to lose today in the advent of AI. So I would say that. So think of AI as something, or a technology that amplifies your abilities rather than holding it to fill in any gaps. If there are any gaps, you do have to still address those and work on those yourself. That would be the main thing.
And what about soft skills? So obviously these are the ones that are so far at least not that easy to automate with AI.
Yeah.
Leadership, communication, influence, etc. How did you develop those, and how important have they been in your role?
I think they're absolutely vital, and if not more important than technical skills when operating in a commercial environment. And in most industries, when you start off in a certain line of work, you typically start as an individual contributor. So there's a certain set of soft skills that is needed for that, but I would say it's still relatively limited. But as you progress in your career, it becomes more and more important, particularly once you start collaborating and then you start becoming perhaps a leader of a team or a manager of a bigger project. And that's when really you have to start thinking about all the human aspects of things. So you might wish to say that someone they're not going along the right trajectory, but what is the best time and place and angle to say that, so that your team doesn't get demoralized? That is something to learn, and it's all about practicing that in not just your professional life but also in day-to-day life with friends and family. Try and be a bit more aware of all the human aspects of emotion and empathy and all of these things, and this is something AI cannot automate for us.
In your this journey of learning new things after you joined the industry, has there been a mentor or there has been a role of mentorship in that journey? Could you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, I think there's been quite a few people who has had a big impact on this. Certainly, various people, people who are senior to me within the company have played a big role in helping me understand the business, the requirements for it, and all the ways in which you could sort of still have your interests and passions fulfilled. So I think in that sense, mentorship has been a big part of it. But again, I think for most people watching this, it's also going to be important to seek out mentorship, not just from within your organization, so whether that's your PhD supervisor or seniors, but also externally. And I think that's where there's a bit of a lack currently out there. As we were, I think, discussing towards the beginning of the conversation, there's some people find it hard to reach out to people, and it can get particularly awkward once you're in a certain industry and maybe you're thinking, oh, am I right or beyond my ways to reach out to someone in this very different industry or a competing company? So that's where mentorship can play a big role, and I feel personally there's a huge gap.
How do you think about career progression in the life science industry? Is there a conventional path or is it more fluid than that?
That's very interesting. I'm still learning and figuring this out myself, but so far my key takeaways is that in certain life science sectors such as consulting, at least for the initial 3 to 6 years, career progression can be a little bit well defined in that sense. So in many consulting firms you would typically start off as what's known as an analyst or associate. Different firms call it differently, and then and that's a pretty much an individual contributor role. And as you progress in your career, you might become a senior analyst or senior associate, and then perhaps an engagement manager, and so on and so forth. So there's a sort of a strict hierarchy and definition in some industries. However, if we look at certain other industries such as let's say venture capital or biotech, things can be a little bit more fluid. So it does vary a little bit, and that's where again it's important to create mentorship networks and seek out what's really the next best step for your career, whether that's within your organization or outside.
And for someone who is 2 or 3 years into their career and feels stuck or unsure of where they should go next, what their next move should be, what would be your advice?
I would say it's always important to kind of look out at what's out there, and sort of not get into this rabbit hole of developing a very strong identity about your professional self. Like, those identities could be around values, etc. But if one starts to think, hey, I am a life science consultant, or hey, I am a venture capitalist, etc., that's when you're purposefully sort of narrowing what you could be, and there's nothing in the world that's pushing you to choose a singular identity. So my suggestion would be to always keep your eyes open as to what's happening around. It's an exciting time out there with all of this AI technologies coming in. There's a lot of new, very unique types of roles coming in these days as well, which may or may not collide with your initial sense of identity about what your career is, but there's a scope of experimentation and revisiting that self-identity from my perspective.
Okay, so this round is going to be a rapid fire.
Okay.
So I'm going to shoot some questions in quick succession here. Best book you've read that has nothing to do with science?
The Idea of Justice by Amartya Sen. It's got nothing to do with science. It's about it's essentially about what understanding from a philosophical perspective what is just or unjust in a society, and it really gave me a framework to think through some of the wider issues in society outside of the lab.
One piece of advice you'd give your 22-year-old self?
It's all going to be okay.
The biggest myth about working in life science?
You cure cancer. We attempt to, let me clarify, but it's still, I guess, from a scientific and innovation standpoint, unfortunately quite a bit far from that.
If you weren't in life sciences, what would you be doing?
Public policy or economics.
And why?
Just another one of my interests, as I think I hinted at, that I really love the intersection of science and numbers. And I think of human beings also in a certain sense as social sciences is truly scientific in that sense. And I think, economics and public policy, this affects our every single decision, not just our health choices. I mean, with life sciences, I can impact people's health choices, but well-being is much more multidimensional than that. And public policy or economics tends to have a far outsized impact in that sense.
What's one question you wish interviewers would ask you, and what's the answer?
Ooh, that's a tricky one. I guess for this sort of an interview, what's my favorite brand name of medicine?
Okay, what is it?
Are we allowed to?
Yeah, why not?
Van Raffia.
Okay. And why do you like it that much?
I don't know, it's just very sharp. I think it's a very well designed name. Honestly, entirely personal opinion, I think a lot of drug names kind of sound silly or artificial a lot of the times, but very seldom do you come across brand names that are really sharp and impactful out there.
We have a few questions from our community of PhD, master's PhD, advanced life science degree holders who would love to get some advice or just thoughts from you. So, someone's saying that I'm finishing my PhD and I don't know whether to look for a postdoc or go into industry. How do I make that call?
I would say, first of all, that's a very important juncture in your career and life in general. From my perspective, my suggestion would be think hard whether you wish to become an academic or not. That is the single most important driver of this decision. And if you wish to become an academic, particularly in sciences, it is important to do a postdoc in most cases these days. So I would highly encourage one to follow that path. If, however, the decision is kind of clear that if an individual wants to move outside of academics, then the sooner you make that transition, the better, and it's best not to kick the can down the road.
Someone's asking that I have applied to dozens of jobs and haven't heard back. What am I doing wrong?
I would say, first of all, perhaps you are asking the wrong question. It's not necessarily about what we are doing wrong, but also about what is it that the market demands. I would say that's how to best frame and think of this sort of a situation. At the moment, it is true that in various geographies, the job market is going through a bit of a difficult period. Hiring in various industries might be a little bit lower than what we saw immediately after the 2021 COVID pandemic situation. So hang in there, but also try and find out what is the market valuing at the moment and what do you need to do to deliver that, whether that involves getting some new skills or maybe phrasing your skills differently in a language that the market understands. So do that research and don't lose hope.
Someone's asked, I feel like I'm the least qualified person in the room whenever I leave academia. How do I get over that?
Oh, I would say that's a very common back in my PhD days, we used to call this the imposter syndrome. It's a real thing. People experience it, and even academics experience it. I often, in my conversations with early career academics who have perhaps just got their tenure track position and they're delivering this important lecture at a scientific organization such as the Royal Society, and they're feeling like they're an imposter and they're feeling least qualified. So it's not just it's very common to have these types of thoughts. I would say focus more on what is it that you can offer rather than trying to see differences versus other people, etc. It might often see that people are more qualified or accomplished than you are, but it's simply because they might have done it for long enough, and that's the beauty of humanity, in that the longer you do it keeps compounding. And so you can, if you like what someone is doing, and with perhaps with the ease, finesse or efficiency with which someone is doing something, try and pick up that skill as soon as you can and keep practicing and you will get there.